The Learning Forward standards for professional learning provide a framework that is tightly connected and nonlinear. Educators may enter these standards from any point, and the framework's cyclical nature supports continuous improvement in education. Hi, this is Kelly Waldrop with a brief overview of each of the 11 Learning Forward standards. Please note that the Learning Forward standards provide a framework for high quality leading, teaching, and learning for both students and teachers. The standards fall into three overarching categories: rigorous content for each learner, transformational processes, and conditions for success. Each standard's core constructs direct actions for educators to take to support students and their teammates. Let's begin with the rigorous content frame. The first standard within rigorous content for each learner addresses learning practices. Educators engage in professional learning to better understand students' backgrounds, experiences, and communities so they can remove barriers to learning and provide equitable opportunities. They collaborate with colleagues to apply this knowledge and continuously improve their practices. Teachers learn about the history, culture, and demographics of their local community to better understand how students' experiences influence learning and engagement. Educators work together to identify barriers such as housing instability, language differences, or mental health needs, and develop strategies to increase student access and success. How does this look in the classroom? Teachers design lessons that connect curriculum to students' interests, cultures, and prior experiences rather than focusing on perceived learning deficits. How does this look across a school? Educators collaborate with special education and support staff to adapt instruction so students with diverse abilities can access rigorous learning while developing independence and confidence. Next, educators strengthen partnerships with students, families, and community members through trust, communication, and collaboration. These relationships help educators better understand students' needs and then connect them with appropriate supports. So, how does this look in action? Well, teachers establish regular two-way communication with families, inviting them to share insights about their child's strengths, interests, and learning needs. Additionally, educators partner with community organizations or local businesses to provide resources, mentorships, technology, even wellness services, or other authentic learning opportunities that enhance student success. Let's continue. Up next in rigorous content for each learner is curriculum, assessment, and instruction. Here, educators build their knowledge of high quality, standards aligned curriculum and instructional materials to ensure all students have access to rigorous, engaging learning experiences. They also advocate for and adopt quality resources when necessary. How does this happen? Teachers evaluate instructional materials to ensure they are aligned to state standards, accessible to all learners, and represent diverse perspectives. When high quality curriculum is unavailable, educators adapt free, research based resources, or educators collaboratively create instructional materials that meet grade level expectations. Next, educators use formative and summative assessments aligned to curriculum to monitor student learning, adjust instruction, and help students achieve rigorous learning goals. They also engage students in understanding and reflecting on their own progress. How does this look in action? Teachers use formative assessments such as exit tickets or classroom discussions to identify misconceptions and modify upcoming lessons. Additionally, grade level teams develop and analyze common assessments to measure student progress, ensure instructional consistency, and plan targeted interventions. Finally, professional learning helps educators effectively implement curriculum through high quality instruction, collaboration, and continuous improvement. Teachers adapt instruction to meet student needs while maintaining rigorous expectations and using technology to enhance learning. What educator actions support this element? Well, teachers participate in collaborative planning sessions to study curriculum units, analyze student work, and refine instructional strategies throughout the school year. Additionally, educators use digital tools and multimedia resources to deliver engaging lessons in face to face, blended, or remote learning environments while adapting instruction for students who need additional support. Let's move on to professional expertise. Here, educators continually strengthen their knowledge by studying professional standards, current research, and evidence based practices. They apply this learning to improve instruction, improve leadership, and improve student outcomes while adapting to changes in standards and curriculum. What does this look like in practice? First, teachers study updated state content standards and revise instruction and assessments to ensure alignment with new curriculum expectations. Another example, literacy educators apply findings from the science of reading research to improve reading instruction and increase student achievement. Our next core concept involves educators developing deep content knowledge, instructional expertise, and role specific skills to effectively teach, lead, and support students. They continuously expand their expertise to meet changing student needs and collaborate across disciplines. How might this look across a school? A mathematics teacher uses student misconceptions and multiple problem solving strategies to strengthen conceptual understanding and differentiate instruction. School leaders participate in professional learning on instructional coaching and adult learning so they can provide meaningful feedback and support teacher growth. Up next, educators align their professional learning with school goals, student standards, and educator performance standards. They collaborate with colleagues to build on prior learning, share expertise, and ensure continuous improvement across the school system. How might this be applied in a school? Professional learning communities, or PLCs, analyze student data together and align instructional strategies with the school's improvement plan. Also, veteran and novice teachers collaborate to share expertise, establish common instructional practices, and support long term professional growth while advancing shared student achievement goals. Now, let's move into the transformational processes frame. Our first standard here directs educators to reflect on how their own experiences, beliefs, and assumptions influence teaching, learning, and decision making. Through professional learning, dialogue, and data analysis, educators identify barriers to learning and make changes that create more equitable opportunities for students and colleagues. What are some examples of this in practice? First, teachers examine classroom data to identify patterns, such as whether certain student groups are underrepresented in advanced learning opportunities, and adjust instructional practices accordingly. Additionally, educators engage in structured discussions about concepts like dignity, belonging, and fairness to recognize personal assumptions and revise policies or classroom practices that may unintentionally limit student success. The next core concept encourages educators to intentionally collaborate with colleagues who bring diverse experiences and viewpoints. This creates trusting, respectful professional learning environments where multiple voices are valued and leads to stronger decisions and improved outcomes for students. What does implementation of this core concept look like? A first example happens when professional learning leaders gather input from teachers with different levels of experience and roles before designing professional development to ensure it meets varied needs. Another example, school teams recognize when one perspective dominates decision making and intentionally adjust meeting norms so all educators have opportunities to contribute to discussions about instruction or school improvement. For the next core concept, educators use evidence, collaboration, and continuous reflection to ensure professional learning, along with instructional practices, meet the needs of every student and educator. They promote inclusive learning environments while using data to identify and address systemic barriers. How is this reflected in practice? Well, school leaders use teacher surveys, classroom observations, and student achievement data to determine professional learning priorities and monitor whether instructional changes improve outcomes for all students. Another example, leadership teams use data dashboards to analyze teacher qualifications, assignments, and student performance, then adjust professional learning and resource allocation to better support both educators and learners. Up next, within transformational processes, is our evidence standard. Here, educators establish a culture where decisions about professional learning are guided by valid, reliable evidence. They build their own and others' capacity to collect, analyze, and interpret data while focusing on meaningful, high quality information rather than simply collecting more data. So, how do we move this from theory to practice? Well, district leaders provide educators with data dashboards and training so teachers and administrators can effectively analyze student achievement and professional learning outcomes. And then school teams can evaluate the quality of survey results by considering factors such as survey fatigue and use only the most relevant data to guide improvement efforts. For our next core concept, educators gather and analyze multiple forms of quantitative, qualitative, formative, and summative data, along with research to identify learning needs and design professional learning that improves educator practice and student achievement. What are some practical applications of this standard? A first example, a leadership team combines student assessment scores, classroom observation notes, teacher surveys, and student engagement data to determine professional learning opportunities. Another example, school leaders analyze disaggregated discipline or gifted program referral data alongside collaborative team discussions to identify inequities and plan targeted professional learning. Our last core concept on this slide involves educators establishing clear goals, benchmarks, and evaluation plans before professional learning begins. They continuously collect and analyze evidence to determine the impact on educator knowledge, instructional practices, and student outcomes, using results to improve future professional learning. So, what does this actually look like? Well, instructional coaches could conduct classroom observations before and after professional learning to document changes in teaching practices and provide feedback for continuous improvement. District leaders could use the KASAB framework, knowledge, attitudes, skills, aspirations, and behaviors, along with student achievement data to evaluate whether professional learning met its intended outcomes and decide whether to continue, expand, or revise the initiative. Let's continue. Next in the transformational processes frame, learning designs, where educators establish clear, measurable professional learning goals based on student needs, educator needs, and school or district priorities. Educators develop a theory of action that outlines how professional learning will improve educator practice and student outcomes while remaining flexible enough to adjust goals based on new evidence. Let's look at this in practice. A district creates a professional learning plan to support implementation of a new math curriculum, while individual schools develop goals focused on improving instructional practices within certain departments. A leadership team uses student achievement data to set a year-long literacy improvement goal, breaking it into quarterly milestones to monitor educator progress and celebrate incremental success. For the next core concept, educators use research from cognitive science and learning theory to design professional learning that is engaging, collaborative, and aligned with how adults learn. Learning experiences are intentionally sequenced to build knowledge, deepen understanding, and support long term changes in practice. Here's how this might look in a school. Teachers begin learning about a new instructional strategy through an independent book study, then participate in collaborative inquiry cycles to apply and refine the strategy in their classrooms. Or professional learning facilitators schedule coaching, reflection, and collaborative discussions throughout the school year so educators can practice new skills, receive feedback, and gradually build expertise. The next core concept involves educators selecting research-supported professional learning strategies that align with their goals. Technology is used strategically here to strengthen educator learning. How would educators see this in their daily work? Teachers participate in PLCs, where they analyze student work, exit tickets, and assessment data to improve curriculum implementation and instructional effectiveness. Instructional coaches could use classroom observations, co-teaching and video analysis, and even virtual coaching to provide individualized feedback and help teachers transfer new learning into daily instructional practice. Up next, implementation. Here, educators recognize that meaningful improvement takes time and requires intentional planning, ongoing support, and research-based change strategies. Leaders communicate a clear vision, monitor progress, and provide structures that help individuals and teams successfully adopt and sustain new practices. Let's explore this in action. Example 1. School leaders use the concerns-based adoption model, CBAM, to assess teachers' readiness for implementing a new curriculum and provide differentiated support throughout the implementation process. A second example, district leaders create a multi-year implementation plan with clear milestones, professional learning, and coaching to help educators successfully adopt a new instructional initiative. The next core concept involves educators building a culture of trust where ongoing constructive feedback is used to improve teaching and learning. Feedback is specific, action-oriented, and comes from multiple sources to support continuous professional growth rather than simply evaluate performance. Now let's make this practical. Instructional coaches observe classroom lessons, provide targeted feedback, and facilitate reflective conversations to strengthen instructional practices. And then PLC teams can engage in peer observations, co-teaching, and collaborative discussions to provide feedback and refine instructional strategies. The next core concept is where educators apply new learning through ongoing practice, coaching, collaboration, and reflection. Professional learning is implemented over time with opportunities for adjustment, celebration of progress, and continuous improvement to ensure lasting changes in educator practice and student outcomes. What would this look like in our classrooms and schools? Well, teachers can participate in repeated cycles of lesson implementation, reflection, coaching, and revision to fully integrate new instructional strategies into daily practice. Additionally, school leaders should adjust schedules, meeting structures, and staffing to provide teachers with dedicated collaboration time while recognizing and celebrating milestones as implementation goals are achieved. Now, let's move to the third and final frame, conditions for success. We'll begin with learning foundations, where educators create a shared belief that continuous professional learning is essential for improving teaching and ensuring every student has access to rigorous, high quality learning. They communicate clear expectations, understand how policies affect education, and work to eliminate barriers that limit learning opportunities. How can we turn this standard into action? One example: district leaders require all professional learning provided by outside vendors to align with district goals for improving student achievement. Another example: school leaders examine how funding, housing, childcare, or even healthcare issues affect student learning and then use that understanding to advocate for supports that remove barriers to success. In the next core concept, educators establish systems, policies, and resources that provide equitable access to meaningful professional learning. They use data, strategic planning, and thoughtful resource allocation to ensure educators have the support needed to improve instruction and student outcomes. How do we make this come to life for educators? Well, district leaders use teacher and student data to identify professional learning needs and design leadership development programs that strengthen the educator workforce. And school leaders allocate dedicated collaboration time, instructional coaches, and funding to support ongoing PLCs and job embedded professional learning. The last core concept in this standard is where educators build a culture of trust, collaboration, and shared responsibility where all staff members feel valued and supported. They encourage open communication, diverse perspectives, continuous feedback, and ongoing reflection to strengthen both professional learning and student success. Let's connect this to regular practice, where leadership teams regularly gather staff feedback through surveys and discussions, then use the results to improve the school's professional learning culture and decision-making processes. Additionally, schools intentionally include educators from diverse roles and backgrounds on leadership committees to ensure multiple perspectives are represented when making instructional and professional learning decisions. Up next is a culture of collaborative inquiry, where educators use ongoing cycles of planning, implementation, reflection, and data analysis to improve teaching and student outcomes. They work collaboratively to identify problems of practice, test solutions, and refine instruction based on evidence, recognizing that meaningful improvement is a continuous process. What does this look like for teachers? A grade level team analyzes student reading data, tests a new instructional strategy over several weeks, reviews the results together, and adjusts instruction based on student progress. Teachers invite peers into their classrooms for instructional observations and reflective feedback conversations to strengthen teaching practices and share successful strategies. For the next core concept, educators intentionally develop the communication, teamwork, and inquiry skills needed for effective collaboration. They establish shared norms, use structured protocols, and engage in meaningful discussions focused on improving instruction and meeting student needs. Some examples of this in practice include PLC teams using student work protocols and data discussions to identify learning gaps and collaboratively plan instructional responses. Additionally, school leaders should facilitate regular collaborative meetings where teachers practice active listening, shared decision making, and respectful dialogue while aligning instructional goals with school improvement priorities. For the final core concept, educators take collective responsibility for every student's success by holding themselves and one another accountable for improving instruction. Through shared reflection, peer feedback, and analysis of student data, they build collective efficacy and continuously strengthen teaching practice. How does this implementation look? First, teachers across grade levels analyze assessment data together to identify students needing additional support and develop coordinated intervention plans. Educators participate in peer observations and coaching cycles using feedback and shared reflection to improve classroom instruction while celebrating collective progress toward student achievement goals. Okay, team, we're almost there. Just a few more. The leadership standard involves educators creating and communicating a shared vision that positions professional learning as the foundation for improving teaching and student achievement. Leaders ensure the vision is collaborative, data informed, aligned with school and district goals, and supported by policies, resources, and ongoing opportunities for educator growth. How can leaders make this happen? One way, a district leadership team develops a professional learning vision concentrated on implementing high quality instructional materials and clearly communicating expectations to all schools. And then principals engage teachers in creating a shared language around professional learning and involve them in planning professional development aligned to school improvement goals. In the next core concept, leaders maintain alignment between professional learning, strategic goals, and instructional priorities by providing ongoing support, monitoring progress, and ensuring resources are focused on initiatives that improve educator effectiveness and student learning. What would you expect to see leaders doing if this standard were fully implemented? You would see school leaders establish peer observation, coaching, collaborative teacher teams, all of these things we've been talking about to strengthen curriculum implementation and instructional practices. And you would also see district leaders analyzing observation data, teacher feedback, and student performance to refine professional learning priorities and discontinue initiatives that no longer align with district goals. For the last core concept on this slide, educators at every level promote the value of professional learning by sharing evidence of its impact, modeling continuous learning, and building support among colleagues, families, school boards, and the community. They use data to demonstrate results and advocate for sustained investment in educator development. How can leaders influence this work in their sphere of responsibility? One example, a principal shares insights from professional reading and participates alongside teachers in professional learning sessions to model lifelong learning and collaborative growth. Another example, district leaders present professional learning outcome data to the school board and community, highlighting improvements in teaching practices and student achievement while advocating for continued funding and support. Let's move to our last standard now, and that is resources, where educators strategically allocate time, funding, personnel, technology, and materials to support high-quality professional learning that aligns with school and district priorities. They ensure resources are coordinated to maximize educator growth and improve student outcomes. What leadership moves would have strong impacts on this standard? One, district leaders hire instructional coaches and mentors while providing substitute teachers so classroom educators can participate in job-embedded professional learning. Another example, school leaders redesign master schedules by creating dedicated PLC collaboration time or using early release days to provide protected time for teacher learning. For the second core concept on this slide, educators use multiple sources of student and educator data to identify areas of greatest need and intentionally direct resources where they will have the greatest impact. They recognize that investments in curriculum, technology, and instructional materials must be paired with high quality professional learning to improve student achievement. So, how do effective leaders bring this to life? One example, a district analyzes achievement, attendance, and graduation data to identify schools with the greatest needs and then assigns experienced instructional coaches and targeted professional learning to those campuses. Another example, when adopting a new high-quality curriculum, school leaders also invest in ongoing teacher training and coaching to ensure effective implementation and improve student learning. For our last core concept, educators continuously evaluate how professional learning resources are used and whether they improve educator practice and student outcomes. They document results, communicate the impact to stakeholders, and adjust future investments based on evidence of effectiveness. What does successful leadership look like in implementing this core concept? First, district leaders track how instructional coaches spend their time, measure improvements in classroom instruction, and use the results to determine whether to expand or modify the coaching program. Additionally, school leaders monitor the impact of dedicated professional learning time by collecting teacher feedback, classroom observation data, and student achievement results. Then share those outcomes with staff, families, and the community to justify continued investment. And that wraps up our Learning Forward standards for professional learning. Professional learning is not just something we do for educators. It is how we build capacity that transforms learning for every student. When we intentionally invest in educators, we ultimately invest in the success of every child. Thank you.